Hello, travelers, adventurers, wanderers, and lore hunters. Today, we're going to be talking about the world of Shadowrun. And we're going to begin with a brief history of the Sixth World. Now, I should begin by explaining what is the Sixth World. Think of it like this. The Fifth World is the world that you and I are currently living in right now. Everything is normal and everything is fine. When things shift over to the Sixth World, that happens when magic returns to the world and changes the course of history forever. The world of Shadowrun is a brilliant mix of cyberpunk and fantasy, and I highly recommend you check it out if you're in any way interested. I haven't played the tabletop role-playing games myself, but I have played Shadowrun Returns, and I'm in the middle of Shadowrun Dragonfall, and I'm loving them both, and I can't wait to get to Hong Kong as well. In fact, the world has sucked me in so much that I've also started getting the PDFs just so I could learn more about the history and the lore and the world. And it's one that I've really very quickly come to love, and I wanted to share with you all as well. If you are playing Shadowrun Returns, and maybe that is your first introduction to this world as it was for me, I'm sure you're no doubt curious to know more about the background of everything that's happened. So sit back, relax, maybe get yourself a drink of tea or coffee, and let me give you the brief history of the Sixth World. I'm sure the history lessons from your corporate rate funded primary school did a great job of sharing the version of history according to whatever corp footed the bill. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone tells the same story about the big moments, but what is lost are the connective fibers between those moments. History is a timeline sprinting backward from where you are right now, zigging and zagging between those huge data points. If you're here listening to this, then where you are now is in the shadows. There is no corporate shutting out cash to turn this into the history they want. In spite of the specific circumstances that led you here, there are certain inexorable occurrences that made it certain that you had no other choice than to become a runner. If you're with the church set, you might think all of this is God's plan, whichever God you subscribe to, of course. These aren't necessarily in chronological order. In our lifetimes, a lot of bad dreck tends to happen all at once, and only after we've sifted through the wreckage do we start to approach the idea of what came first and how it all affects us. This world is harsh and unfriendly, but it also makes a dreck load of sense. You pull on the right threads, you can trace where your life is now all the way back to the beginning, and it all started with a plague. Virtually induced toxic allergy syndrome, also known as VTAS, hit the world in two waves. The first emergence of the disease was in 2010 in a crowded corner of New Delhi. The disease caught like dry kindling and spread across the planet. By 2011, 1 out of every 4 people on the planet was dead or dying from this disease. The hardest hit were the densest world populations of China, Bahrain, and Bangladesh. Mexico was the first government to collapse under the weight of the disease. Its citizens predictably fled north toward the promise of medical care. What happened next is still the subject of speculation. Unexplained genetic expression, also known as UGE, touched 10% of the remaining population. Children were being born with significant physiological differences from so-called normal kids. The media quickly classified these changes into catchy categories with names borrowed from popular fantasy, such as dwarf and elf. Soon after, the phenomenon called goblinization introduced orcs and trolls. Like VTAS, there wasn't a person on the planet who didn't know someone affected by these changes. The new meta-racial immersion knew no class. They tried to make it seem like otherwise now, but the elves weren't all born to wealthy parents, and the trolls and orcs weren't all dumped into the slums. My father was born to a wealthy Texas oil family, and they hid him from the public because he was born an orc. Goblinization sparked fears that this was a side effect or even the next wave of VTAS, but that wave was still to come further down the line. It hit in early 2022 and resulted in the death of another 10% of the remaining population. None of the emerging meta-races were spared. However, VTAS helped us metahumans because it allowed the research to be done to prove that goblinization was not a side effect or an infection path of VTAS. Doctors discovered that UGE was not even a disease in and of itself. UGE was the genuine emergence of new races. We'd learn soon enough that those myths and legends that inspired the names of those races had a basis in reality. But before we could set about working together, the Pope gave a speech that stopped just short of justifying the murder of metahuman children. What it did was announce that it was okay to hate metas, and that hate came fast and hot. Ayatollah Hamidullah of Iran declared jihad against metahumanity, only to have the great dragon Aiden declare war on the Ayatollah and win it forcefully. That didn't stop the spread of hate, however, and hate groups formed in every nation. Some continued to blame Vitas on the metahumans, even though they had zero evidence to back this up. Sometimes, people said that tensions between metatypes overwhelmed tensions based on skin color, but as often is the case, it's not that simple. Those old tensions didn't flame out. The arrival of the new races was more like throwing napalm on a forest fire. Suddenly, everyone had an other to be mad at, and terrifyingly fewer of their own that they needed to protect. A second wave of UGE, called Surge, struck with the return of Halley's Comet in 2061, setting off a new wave of racism as more meta variants poured out into the world. It proved once and for all that UGE was unrelated to Vitas. Not that the true deniers even cared. Now, being so far removed from that plague, it's hard to think about what losing 1 of 4 people globally actually did to society. Above all else, it created a power vacuum that the corporate world was in the best position to fill. And fill it did. But that's a story for another session. Please do come back if you'd like to learn more.